You are home. The door is closed behind you. The specific sounds of the street, the wheels on cobblestones, the calls of vendors, the general organic noise of a city going about its business have been reduced to a muffled background. The fire is lit, the candles are burning, and the evening, which stretches from approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon to 9 or 10 at night when the household goes to bed, is yours. Or rather, it belongs to the household, which is a different thing entirely. The year is somewhere between 1720 and 1790. The location is a middling household in a medium-sized English town, not London with its specific metropolitan character and its specific metropolitan problems, but a town of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people, prosperous enough to have a weekly market and a grammar school, and a decent number of trade-person households that have achieved the specific comfortable status that the 18th century called middling sort. You are neither poor nor wealthy. You are a craftsman or a shopkeeper or a lesser professional. You have a house with several rooms. You have a servant, probably, or at least occasional hired help. You have food on the table and candles in the holders, and the specific domestic security of someone who has, through their own labor and some degree of luck, arrived at a situation that their grandparents might have considered remarkable. This is not the 18th century of the history books, not the 18th century of great political events and philosophical revolutions, and the specific drama of kings and wars, and the origins of modernity. This is the 18th century of the evening, the specific quiet hours between the end of the working day and the beginning of sleep, the domestic interior of ordinary life that the history books have always undervalued because it is not dramatic and does not involve famous people doing famous things. But here is what those quiet hours contained, and here is why they matter. The 18th century evening was a specific period in which the culture of the private domestic interior was invented, not discovered, invented. The specific practices and pleasures of the home evening, the reading, the needlework, the music, the conversation, the board games, the letter writing, the specific rituals of tea and supper, were developing and consolidating during this specific period into the forms that subsequent centuries would inherit, and that many modern people, in substantially modified form, still practice. The 18th century invented the home as a place you were glad to be, not just a shelter, not just a functional space for sleeping and eating, but a specific cultural environment that you had opinions about, that you invested in making pleasant, that you understood as reflecting your specific identity and your specific values. The curtains mattered, the wallpaper mattered, the specific arrangement of furniture mattered. These were not the concerns of wealthy people with too much time. They were the concerns of a social class that had achieved sufficient economic stability to think about how they lived, not just whether they lived. What happened in those evenings, what the middling people of 18th century England actually did between 5 and 10 o'clock, is the subject of this video, and it is considerably more interesting than it sounds. Let's go inside. Chapter 1. The room. Understanding. The space where everything happened before we can understand what 18th century people did in their evenings. We need to understand the specific room where they did it, because the physical environment of the 18th century middling household was both more limited and more deliberately arranged than modern people typically imagine, and the specific constraints of the space shaped everything that happened within it. The concept of the parlor, or, in its more formal version, the sitting room, was itself a relatively new development in the 18th century domestic landscape. Earlier domestic interiors had been more functionally mixed. The main room of the house served for eating, sitting, working, and receiving visitors simultaneously, with furniture arranged and rearranged to accommodate different activities as needed. The specific differentiation of domestic space into rooms with designated functions, a dining room for eating, a parlor for sitting and socializing, a kitchen for cooking, was a development that the 18th century middling household was in the process of making, and the parlor was the specific room where this development was most visible. The parlor was the room you showed people, not the kitchen where the servant or the housewife did the actual work of sustaining the household. Not the bedchambers, which were private. The parlor was the semi-public face of the domestic interior. The room where you received visitors, where you spent your evenings, where the household's best furniture and its best objects were displayed. The specific investment in the parlor's appearance, the quality of the furniture, the presence of a fireplace with a proper mantelpiece, the specific textiles of the curtains and upholstery, was an investment in the household's public presentation of itself. The fireplace was the physical and social center of the 18th century parlor in ways that require specific imagination to fully appreciate. Not because open fires were romantic or atmospheric, though they were sometimes both, but because the fireplace was the only heat source in the room, and the room was genuinely cold without it. The specific geography of 18th century parlor life was determined by proximity to the fire. The best seats were nearest the fire. The work that required fine eyesight was done in the fire's immediate vicinity, and the specific social hierarchy of the household was visibly mapped onto the arrangement of bodies around the hearth. The fire was wood or coal, depending on the region, the period, and the household's resources. Coal, increasingly common as the 18th century progressed, and coal distribution networks expanded from the mining regions of Newcastle and Durham, produced a different quality of heat and light from wood. Coal burned hotter but required specific management. It was slower to light, produced significant smoke until properly established, and needed specific equipment. The coal scuttle, the poker, the specific grate designed for coal rather than wood, to manage effectively. The candles that lit the 18th century parlor deserve specific attention because they were a significant expense, and their management was itself a domestic skill. Tallow candles, the cheaper variety made from rendered animal fat, burned with a yellow flame and produced a specific smell that accumulated in rooms over an evening of use. Wax candles, made from beeswax and considerably more expensive, burned cleaner and brighter. The specific choice of candle, the specific positioning of candlesticks to maximize useful light, the specific management of candle height and wick trimming that kept the flame burning efficiently. These were household management skills that the housewife or servant managed with the specific attentiveness of someone managing an expensive consumable. The specific light level of a room lit by candles was not adequate for detailed close work by modern standards. Needlework, reading, writing, these activities required either positioning very close to the candle or the use of specific light concentrating devices. The reading glass, a convex lens that concentrated candlelight onto a specific area, was a common domestic accessory that addressed the specific problem of insufficient light for detailed work. The specific strain of reading by candlelight, performed for hours on end by people who didn't have the option of better lighting, produced the specific pattern of eye strain and headache that the period's medical literature describes as commonplace. The furniture of the middling household parlor was, by the standards of the aristocratic interiors that are most photographed and most preserved, modest. But it was not bare or purely functional. The 18th century was the great age of English furniture making, the period of Chippendale, of Hepplewhite, of Sheraton. and the specific designs of these makers filtered down through regional furniture makers and craftsmen to produce household furniture that had genuine aesthetic ambition without the specific luxury of the very finest pieces. A middling household parlor might contain a settee or two chairs with the upholstered seats and backs, a gate-legged table or drop-leaf table that could be expanded for dining and folded for storage, a chest of drawers or bureau for storing household papers and small items, perhaps a desk or secretary for writing, a clock on the mantelpiece, and on the walls, perhaps a mirror in a painted frame, and possibly a picture or two, an engraving, a map, something that represented the household's specific engagement with the visual culture that the 18th century print trade was making increasingly available to people below the level of those who could commission original paintings. The specific material of the upholstery, the wool damask or printed cotton that covered the seat cushions, was chosen both for its appearance and for its durability, because the middling household was a household that expected to use its furniture, not preserve it in a state museum condition. The specific color schemes of 18th century interiors, the greens and blues and reds that appear in surviving examples and in the period's descriptive writing, were deliberate aesthetic choices within a decorating tradition that took color seriously as a component of domestic comfort. The window treatments, the curtains or shutters that managed the specific problem of drafts and cold. In windows that were single glazed and therefore significant sources of heat loss, were simultaneously functional and decorative. The specific management of windows in winter, the heavy curtains drawn against the draft, the shutters closed against the cold, transformed the room from an extension of the outside world into a specifically enclosed, specifically warm interior that was a refuge from the specific physical unpleasantness of 18th century winters. Chapter 2. Tea. The ritual that organized the evening. At some point in the early evening, the kettle is put on, and the ritual of tea begins. The specific cultural importance of tea in 18th century England is difficult to overstate, and the specific timing of its adoption. It became a widespread domestic practice across multiple social classes during the 18th century, having been a luxury item confined to the wealthy in the late 17th century, makes it one of the defining features of the specific period we're examining. Tea in 1720 was expensive. Tea in 1780 was still not cheap, but it was accessible to the middling household in a way that it hadn't been to the household's grandparents. The specific reduction in tea prices over the 18th century, driven partly by the expansion of East India Company trade and partly by the specific 1784 Commutation Act that dramatically reduced tea duties and simultaneously collapsed the smuggled tea trade, meant that the middling households' evening tea was a practice with a specific economic history embedded in it. The tea equipage, the specific set of objects required for proper tea service, was itself a significant domestic investment and a significant social statement. The teapot, the cups and saucers, the cream jug, the sugar basin, these were objects that the household owned, displayed, and used as markers of domestic respectability in ways that made the tea service simultaneously a beverage preparation system and a social performance technology. The specific ceramics of the 18th century tea service are worth a moment of attention because they are one of the places where the period's visual culture and its domestic culture intersect most directly. The blue and white Chinese porcelain that was the prestige teaware of the early 18th century, imported in vast quantities by the East India Company and visible in portraits and inventories across the social spectrum, gave way as the century progressed to English pottery and porcelain that increasingly competed with the Chinese imports in quality and availability. Wedgwood's cream ware, introduced in the 1760s, made high-quality ceramic tableware accessible to middling households that couldn't afford Chinese porcelain. The tea ritual itself, the specific sequence of heating the pot, measuring the tea, pouring the boiling water, waiting, pouring into cups through a strainer, adding milk and sugar according to preference, was performed with a regularity and a seriousness that reflected its status as a daily domestic ceremony rather than merely a beverage preparation. The specific role of the housewife in managing the tea service, controlling access to the tea caddy, which was typically locked because tea was expensive enough to warrant security against servant pilfering, managing the quantity of tea used, presiding over the distribution of cups, was a management role with real economic significance. The tea was drunk in the parlor in the evening, with the specific social arrangement that the room and the fire made possible. People sat, they talked, they held their cups in the specific way that surviving portraits of tea drinking capture. The pinched handle grip, the saucer used as a cooling vessel by some, the specific posture of sociable sitting that tea drinking produced. The conversation that accompanied the tea was not incidental to the tea. The tea was the occasion for the conversation, the specific social technology that organized people around a shared activity and created the conditions for the specific kind of talk that the 18th century valued. The food that accompanied the evening tea, the bread and butter, the small cakes, the specific confections that the 18th century domestic kitchen produced for this purpose, was lighter than the supper that might follow and heavier than the mere drink that tea alone would represent. The specific 18th century practice of buttered bread with tea was so consistent and so widespread that it became a cultural marker, the bread and butter of the middling household's evening, referenced in literature, in domestic advice writing, and in the specific household accounts that careful housewives maintained. The sugar that sweetened the tea was itself a product of the specific historical moment of the 18th century. Caribbean sugar production, organized on the specific economic system of plantation slavery, had made sugar increasingly available and increasingly affordable over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the specific relationship between the British middle class's tea-drinking habit and the Atlantic slave trade that made the sugar possible was not discussed with the same moral clarity that modern retrospection applies to it. The 18th century household that sweetened its tea was participating in a global economic system of specific moral complexity, and the specific sweetness of the tea was inseparable from the specific brutality of that system. The tea party, the specific social occasion organized around tea service, which brought visitors into the parlor for the express purpose of tea drinking and conversation, was one of the primary social forms of 18th century middling life. Not the elaborate, heavily ritualized tea parties of the aristocracy that novels like Jane Austen's describe from the outside, but the specific domestic practice of inviting a neighbor, a friend, a relative to share the evening tea. The specific economy of the tea party, more intimate than a dinner, less expensive, requiring less preparation and less formal service, made it the accessible social form for households that wanted to maintain social relationships without the specific cost of more elaborate entertainment. Chapter 3. The Needlework Hour. What women did and why it mattered. For the women of the 18th century middling household, the evening had a specific and expected activity that shaped how the hours were spent. Needlework. This needs unpacking because needlework in the 18th century context covers a range of activities so wide and so varied in their character and purpose that the single word obscures more than it reveals. At one end of the spectrum was the practical needlework of household maintenance, the specific mending, hemming, and sewing that kept the household's textile resources in functional condition. The 18th century household's textiles, the clothing, the household linens, the furnishing fabrics, were expensive enough to be worth maintaining carefully, and the specific work of maintenance fell primarily to women. Darning worn sections of stockings, repairing the seams of garments, hemming new linens. These were economically significant activities that preserved the household's investment in its textile resources. At the other end of the spectrum was the decorative embroidery and fine needlework that served entirely different social and aesthetic purposes. The embroidered pictures, the worked fire screens, the elaborate bed hangings, and cushion covers that appear in 18th century domestic inventories and surviving objects. These were products of hours of skilled work that served as demonstrations of the worker's accomplishment, patience, and the specific qualities of femininity that the 18th century valued in women. In between these poles was the enormous range of specific textile crafts that occupied middling women's evenings. Knitting, which was practical, stockings, caps, mittens, but could also be socially performed. Lace making in regions where that tradition was maintained. Quilting, the making of decorative accessories, and the various forms of embroidery that ranged from the simple to the extraordinarily complex. The specific relationship between needlework and conversation is one that 18th century domestic writing addresses repeatedly. Needlework was the activity that made conversation possible by occupying the hands without occupying the mind. The woman who sat with her needlework could sustain a conversation indefinitely. The hands were busy, the eyes moved between the work and the speaker, but the mind was fully engaged with the talk. This specific combination of manual occupation and mental engagement was understood as one of the specific virtues of needlework as an evening activity. The knitting, the specific click of needles that the 18th century parlor added to its sound environment, was faster, more productive, and more portable than embroidery. And its specific social character was different. Knitting could be taken up and put down without losing much, and could be performed in worse light than fine embroidery. The specific economy of knitting, turning wool into finished objects with direct household utility, made it the more practically valuable activity in households where utility and aesthetics competed for priority. The men of the household were not in most cases doing needlework in the evenings. The specific gender division of evening activity was real and was observed. It would have been remarkable and remarked upon for a middling tradesman to spend his evening with a needle and thread in a domestic context. Men's evening activities were different, and we will address them, but it's worth noting that the specific domestic interior of the 18th century evening was shaped in large part by the expectations and activities of its female inhabitants, and that the domestic culture of the period cannot be understood without understanding women's specific relationship to the evening hours, the domestic advice literature of the 18th century, the specific genre of books and pamphlets that addressed housewives and mothers on the management of their households and the education of their children, consistently positioned needlework as both practically important and morally significant. The woman who spent her evenings in useful needlework was demonstrating the specific virtues of industry, economy, and domestic management that the period's domestic ideology valorized. The woman who spent her evenings in idleness or in the specific idleness of novel reading, a contested activity, was failing a specific moral test. The specific tension between industry and pleasure in the 18th century domestic evening is one of the most interesting features of the period's cultural life. The moral framework within which middling people understood their leisure was not the modern framework of earned relaxation following completed work. It was a framework in which leisure itself required justification, in which the specific forms of evening activity were evaluated not just for their pleasantness, but for their consistency with the specific values: industry, self-improvement, sociability, domestic competence that the middling identity depended on. Chapter 4. Reading: The Revolution That Happened. In armchairs, the 18th century was, among many other things, the century in which ordinary people began to read for pleasure, not the first century in which anyone read for pleasure. That had been happening for as long as there had been pleasurable things to read, but the first century in which the specific practice of reading for pleasure in domestic evening settings was widespread enough, and culturally significant enough, and economically accessible enough to constitute a social phenomenon rather than an elite luxury. The specific material conditions that made this possible were developments of the preceding century and the early 18th century, the expansion of the print trade, the reduction in book prices, driven by competition and improved production methods, the development of the circulating library as a commercial institution that made books available to people who couldn't afford to buy them, and the rise of the periodical press. The newspapers, magazines, and journals that brought printed material into households on a weekly or monthly schedule. The circulating library deserves specific attention because it was a specifically 18th century institution of considerable cultural importance that has no precise modern equivalent. You paid an annual subscription, between half a guinea and a guinea typically, and in exchange, you had access to the library's stock of books, which you could borrow one or two at a time, return when finished, and replace with another. The circulating library's stock was not the serious literature of scholars. It was the popular literature of its moment. Novels, travel narratives, collections of letters, popular histories, improving tracts, and the specific category of fiction that the 18th century was inventing in real time. The novel was new. This is one of the specific features of 18th century literary culture that requires specific emphasis, because modern people take the novel so completely for granted that the specific novelty, in every sense, of the form in the 18th century is hard to register. Samuel Richardson's Pamela appeared in 1740. Henry Fielding's Tom Jones appeared in 1749. Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy began appearing in 1759. These were not contributions to an existing tradition. They were the establishment of a tradition, the specific development of the novel as the primary narrative form for the emerging reading culture of the middling sort. The specific experience of reading these novels in the 18th century domestic evening was an experience that we can partially reconstruct from the letters, diaries, and other evidence that the period's literate population left behind. The novels were read aloud. Sometimes the family gathered in the parlor, one member reading while the others listened and worked, or they were read silently, in the specific private absorption that the novel's direct address to the individual reader's imagination made possible. Or they were read in installments, passing between household members with the specific social experience of shared reading, generating conversation about characters and events that became for a time as real as the people next door. The moral panic about novel reading was real, consistent, and as ineffective as most moral panics about popular culture. The specific concern, that novel reading would inflame the imaginations of young women, give them unrealistic expectations about love and marriage, make them dissatisfied with the specific domestic realities of their lives, and generally unfit them for the practical business of being wives and mothers, was expressed in sermons, in domestic advice literature, in periodical essays, and in the specific parental prohibition of novel reading that appears in enough autobiographical accounts to have been a common domestic practice. Young women read the novels anyway. They hid them in needlework bags. They borrowed them from friends. They read them late at night by inadequate candlelight. The specific persistence of novel reading against parental prohibition is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the novels were genuinely compelling, that whatever the moralists said about their effects, the specific experience of reading them was one that their readers found genuinely valuable. The newspapers of the 18th century brought a different kind of reading into the domestic evening. The specific development of the newspaper press. London had multiple daily papers by mid-century, and provincial towns had their own weekly papers, created a reading practice that was simultaneously personal and public, connecting the domestic interior to the world of events through the specific medium of print. The reading of newspapers in the 18th century household was often communal. The paper was read aloud, or sections of it were shared between members of the household, or its contents were discussed in the specific conversational mode that the period's domestic culture favored. The specific news that the 18th century newspaper contained: parliamentary proceedings, foreign intelligence, shipping news, commercial information, criminal trials, and the specific miscellany of local and national event that the papers compiled, was the raw material for the evening's conversation in a household that had no television, no radio, and no other mechanism for staying connected to events beyond its immediate locality. The periodical essay, the specific literary form developed by Addison and Steele's Spectator in 1711 and imitated by dozens of subsequent publications, was perhaps the single most important piece of print culture for the 18th century middling household's evening. The Spectator appeared daily, contained essays on manners, morals, literature, and the specific social culture of the period, and was explicitly addressed to the mixed household audience of men and women, educated and less educated, who made up the emerging reading public. It was designed to be read in the domestic evening, and its specific prose style, accessible, conversational, gently moral without being preachy, was calibrated to exactly this reading context. Chapter 5. Music, the parlor as concert hall. The 18th century middling household made music, not passively consumed it, not attended performances of it as occasional entertainment, but actually produced it, played instruments, sang, gathered around a keyboard or a fiddle to perform for each other the specific musical culture that the period valued as an accomplishment and an entertainment simultaneously. The harpsichord, and later the fortepiano, the precursor of the modern piano, increasingly available and increasingly affordable as the century progressed, was the prestige instrument of the parlor. Owning one was a statement of cultural aspiration and moderate wealth. Being able to play it was a demonstration of the specific education and cultivation that the middling household was investing in its daughters as part of their preparation for adult social life. The specific education of young women in keyboard playing was one of the significant investments that middling families made in their daughters' social capital. Music lessons from the specific music masters who served the middling market were expensive, regular, and taken seriously in households that understood musical accomplishment as a marker of the specific femininity that would make their daughters attractive as marriage partners. and competent as social entertainers. The music played in the 18th century parlor was not primarily the complex concert music of professional performance. It was dance music, song accompaniments, simplified arrangements of popular operatic airs, and the specific domestic repertoire that publishers produced specifically for the amateur musician market. The music publishing industry of the 18th century was, in significant part, organized around this domestic amateur market, producing keyboard arrangements, song collections, and chamber music at price points and difficulty levels calibrated to reach the middling household's parlor. The Vauxhall songs, the specific popular songs associated with the pleasure gardens of London that were distributed in printed collections throughout the century, were among the most widely performed pieces in the 18th century domestic interior. These were songs designed to be sung, accessible in range and technical demand, emotionally immediate, and tuneful enough to stick in the mind after a single hearing. And their specific cultural position as the pop music of their moment is reflected in how widely and how repeatedly they appear in the evidence of domestic musical activity. The fiddle, the violin in its less formal, more improvisatory domestic guise, occupied a different social position from the harpsichord. Where the keyboard was the accomplishment of daughters and wives, the fiddle was more often the instrument of the man of the house, played in a freer, less formally educated way that reflected its specific connection to the folk and dance traditions that the 18th century was beginning to distinguish from the serious music of formal culture. The specific music of the evening was often dance music, not dance to in the parlor necessarily, though dancing did happen in domestic settings, but performed as music that was associated with dancing and that carried the specific energy of dance into a sitting context. The country dances and reels that were the popular dancing tradition of 18th century England existed in the same musical culture as the formal minuets and other ballroom dances, and the specific domestic musical culture of the evening drew on both traditions. The singing of catches and glees, the specific polyphonic vocal forms that were one of the characteristic musical entertainments of 18th century English social life, was practiced in households where multiple household members could sing. A catch was a round, a melody sung in overlapping entries by multiple voices, creating a specific harmonic texture from relatively simple individual parts. And the specific entertainment value of catches came partly from their musical interest and partly from the specific comic or satirical texts that the most popular ones used. The catch clubs, formal organizations devoted to the performance of catches and glees, were primarily masculine institutions, meeting in taverns and clubs for the specific musical sociability of communal singing. But the domestic version of this tradition, the household gathering around a keyboard or without accompaniment, working through the familiar catches that everyone knew, was a specifically domestic entertainment that the parlor evening accommodated. The specific acoustic quality of 18th century domestic music performance is something that modern people can barely imagine, because the specific experience of hearing an instrument played in a small room by an amateur is genuinely different from the amplified recorded music that constitutes the modern experience of hearing music. The immediacy, the physical presence of the sound source, the specific imperfections of amateur performance, the interaction between performer and listener that live performance in a small space produces, was part of the specific experience. The music was not always good by professional standards. It didn't need to be. It was present, it was live, and it was theirs. Chapter 6. Conversation. The art form nobody, talks about in the 18th century, conversation was not something that happened incidentally while people were doing other things. It was something that was taken seriously, practiced deliberately, and evaluated aesthetically in ways that modern conversation rarely is. The specific art of conversation, knowing what to say, when to say it, how to say it, and crucially when to stop saying it, was a genuine accomplishment that the period valued and the period's educational culture tried to cultivate. The philosophical and social literature of the period was full of treatises, essays, and observations about conversation, its proper conduct, its specific virtues and failures, the specific behaviors that made a good conversationalist, and the specific behaviors that made a bad one. Jonathan Swift wrote about the art of polite conversation with specific satirical examples of what it should not be. The Spectator devoted multiple essays to the topic. Samuel Johnson, whose conversational abilities were legendary enough to be the subject of an entire book. Boswell's Life of Johnson is substantially a record of Johnson's conversation. Clearly thought of conversation as one of the highest human arts. The specific virtues that the 18th century valued in conversation were distinct from what modern conversation culture values. Wit, the specific ability to produce clever, unexpected, amusing observations that illuminated a subject from an unexpected angle, was highly prized, but it needed to be employed with care. Wit that was too sharp, that drew blood, that humiliated its targets, was a social failure as much as a personal one. Learning, the ability to bring knowledge to a conversation and deploy it usefully, was valued, but pedantry was specifically condemned. The learning that impressed was learning worn lightly, knowledge deployed in service of the conversation rather than in demonstration of the possessor. The specific social management of the mixed domestic evening, the parlor gathering of household members, plus perhaps a few visitors, required specific conversational skills that the 18th century was in the process of articulating and codifying. The specific challenge of mixed sex, mixed age, mixed social position conversation was not addressed by modern prescriptions for managing diversity. It was addressed through the specific cultural technology of politeness, the specific behaviors and attitudes that allowed people of different backgrounds and interests to inhabit the same conversational space without the specific frictions that difference might otherwise produce. The emergence of the concept of politeness as a central 18th century social value is directly relevant to the specific character of domestic evening conversation. Politeness, understood not as superficial manners, but as the specific cultivation of the social virtues that made communal life pleasant, was both a personal moral achievement and a social necessity. The polite person knew how to manage their own stronger opinions in company, how to find common ground with people whose views differed from their own, and how to maintain the specific tone of agreeable sociability that the domestic evening required. The topics available for domestic evening conversation were broad, but not unlimited. The specific social calculus of what could be discussed in mixed company, men and women, different ages, different political and religious persuasions possibly present, shaped which subjects were raised and how they were treated. Religion and politics were the specific topics most likely to produce the heat that polite conversation tried to avoid, and the specific 18th century domestic convention of managing these topics with care reflects the specific social reality that mixed gatherings contained people who strongly held views could, if incautiously expressed, produce the conversational breakdown that politeness was designed to prevent. The gossip, the specific exchange of social information about mutual acquaintances that was both the most consistently practiced form of domestic conversation and the most consistently deplored in the prescriptive literature, was everywhere. The specific knowledge of who was courting whom, whose business was in difficulty, whose health was declining, whose daughter had made a good or bad match. This was the currency of domestic social life, and the domestic evening was one of the primary occasions for its circulation. The specific gender dynamics of domestic evening conversation were complex. The prescriptive literature, the advice about how conversations should be conducted, was full of specific guidance about how men and women should interact in mixed conversation. Men should moderate their topics for female company. Women should listen with specific appreciation without venturing opinions that exceeded their specific sphere of knowledge. The actual practice of domestic evening conversation, as preserved in diaries and letters, was considerably more various and more interesting than the prescriptive literature suggests. Chapter 7. Games and Cards. The evening's organized pleasures. After the tea, sometime in the middle of the evening, the cards came out. Card playing was one of the primary organized entertainment activities of the 18th century middling household's evening, and its specific social character. Communal, competitive, structured around shared rules, generating the specific excitement of uncertain outcome, made it ideal for the domestic gathering. The specific card games of the 18th century domestic interior were different from the card games that modern people associate with card playing. Whist, the specific trick-taking game that became the dominant card game of 18th century England, required 4 players, involved partnership play, demanded specific skills of memory and inference, and generated the specific social dynamics of competitive play between people who might be playing against their spouses, their friends, or their neighbors. Whist's specific social character was part of its appeal. It was a game that required sustained attention over an extended period, that rewarded skill and punished inattention, and that created the specific social context of partners who needed to develop understanding of each other's play without violating the rule against communication during the game. The specific relationship between partners in whist, the communication through play, the shared victories and defeats, the specific post-game analysis of what should have been played, was a distinct social dynamic that whist cultivated and that its players valued. The gambling that accompanied card playing in 18th century domestic settings is a topic that requires specific treatment because it was both widespread and widely condemned, and the specific tension between the entertainment value of card playing and the moral concerns about gambling was one of the consistent features of 18th century domestic cultural life. Playing cards for money, even small amounts, even the specific penny-a-point stakes that the middling household's card game might involve, was disapproved of in the moral literature of the period, with a consistency that reflected genuine concern about the specific social dynamics that gambling produced. The specific concern was not primarily about large losses, though those happened. It was about the specific moral habits that gambling cultivated, the excitement for uncertain outcome, the specific subordination of other concerns to the game's demands, the particular emotional volatility of winning and losing. The domestic response to this moral concern was the specific 18th century practice of playing for very small stakes that maintained the structure of the game, the specific excitement of having something at risk without the specific moral damage of gambling in the full sense. The penny a point, or the small counter game, was a compromise between the game's entertainment value and the household's moral self-image, and it was a compromise that most middling households seem to have found workable. The backgammon board, the specific combination of board, dice, and counters that the game required, was a standard piece of domestic furniture in many 18th century households. and its specific presence in household inventories and in domestic interiors, depicted in period paintings, suggests that backgammon was a consistent evening activity for two players. The specific combination of skill and chance in backgammon. The dice introduced the element of luck, but the management of the resulting positions required genuine skill, made it appealing to a wide range of players. Chess, the purely skill-based board game that the 18th century increasingly associated with serious intellectual accomplishment, occupied a different cultural position from the social card games. Chess was two-player, required sustained concentration that made simultaneous conversation difficult, and rewarded a specific kind of analytical thinking that the period associated with masculine intellectual accomplishment. It appears in 18th century domestic interiors less frequently than cards or backgammon, but consistently enough to be recognized as a domestic evening activity. The parlor games, the specific verbal and social games that required no equipment beyond the players themselves, were another feature of the domestic evening that the evidence of the period documents with some frequency. Word games, riddles, memory games, the specific competitive guessing games that occupied groups of people in the specific social context of the domestic evening. These were the low-cost, high-engagement entertainment that the mixed household gathering could produce when cards were not the activity of the evening. Chapter 8. Supper, the last meal and its social significance. The specific meal that ended the 18th century middling household's evening was not dinner. Dinner, the main meal of the day, had been eaten in the early afternoon, somewhere between 12 and 3 o'clock, depending on the household's specific schedule. The evening meal, supper, was a lighter, later affair, typically appearing around 8 or 9 o'clock and serving as both the day's final nourishment and the specific occasion for the household to gather one more time before the business of going to bed. The supper in a middling household was not elaborate. The economics of the household and the specific position of supper as a second rather than a primary meal meant that it was appropriately modest. Cold meats from the earlier dinner, if there were any, bread and butter, cheese, perhaps some cold pie, pickles, the specific cold preparations that required no cooking and could be assembled quickly by the servant or the housewife from whatever the larder contained. The cold meats of the 18th century supper deserve specific attention because they reflect the specific food preservation practices of the period. Meat cooked at dinner and remaining at supper was not refrigerated in any modern sense. It sat in the larder, which was a cool room or cupboard designed to retard spoilage through low temperature and air circulation at temperatures that were adequate for short-term holding. The specific practice of eating cold meat at supper was both practical. It required no additional cooking, which meant no additional fuel and no additional labor from the servant, and acceptable because cold meat from a good dinner was genuinely palatable. The pickles and preserved vegetables that accompanied cold meat at 18th century supper were products of the household's preservation practices. The specific bottled and pickled preparations that the housewife produced in season for year-round use. Pickled cucumbers, pickled walnuts, preserved mushrooms, various chutneys and relishes. These were the condiments that transformed simple cold meat into something more interesting, and their production was a significant element of the annual cycle of household food management. The bread at supper was the same bread that had been served throughout the day. The specific household loaf from the baker, or from the household's own baking if the household baked its own bread, which middling households in this period increasingly did not, preferring to buy from the specialist baker rather than maintaining the specific equipment and skill of home baking. The cheese that appeared at supper was one of the most consistent features of the period's cold supper table, and the specific cheeses available reflected both the regional traditions of English cheesemaking and the specific commercial networks that brought cheese from producing regions to consuming households. Cheshire cheese, Gloucester cheese, the specific regional varieties that had developed over centuries of English dairy farming. These were the cheeses that appeared at the middling household supper table, providing the specific protein and fat that rounded out a meal otherwise dominated by bread and cold meat. The supper drink was not tea. Tea was the drink of the earlier evening, and the late evening drink was typically something stronger. Small beer, the very low alcohol beer that was the standard household drink for most of the day. Or a glass of something more substantial. Rum punch, perhaps, or a negus. A specific drink of port wine, hot water, sugar, and nutmeg that was a characteristic 18th century domestic social drink. Or simply the household's specific wine or spirit of preference. The specific social character of supper, the gathered household at the day's end, the comfortable informality of cold food eaten with little ceremony, the specific relaxed conversation of people who had spent the evening together and were winding down toward bed, was one of the more genuinely pleasant features of the 18th century domestic evening. The elaborate service of dinner, with its specific social performance of hierarchy and household management, had been completed hours earlier. Supper was the domestic interior at its most informal, the household at its most itself. Chapter 9. The servant question, the other person in the room. The middling household almost invariably had at least one servant, and the presence of that servant in the household space, in the household's evening, in the specific economic and social relationship that the servant represented, was one of the most significant and most consistently under-acknowledged features of 18th century domestic life. The servant in a middling household was typically a young woman, a maid of all work, as the period called the single servant of a household that couldn't afford specialization. Who did the specific labor of household maintenance, the cooking, the cleaning, the fire laying and water carrying, the washing, and the ironing, the specific physical work that the household's domestic functioning required? The question of where the servant spent the evening was not a simple one. In theory, and in the prescriptive literature of household management, the servant's evening time was spent in the kitchen, performing or completing the specific household tasks that the evening required, and not intruding on the family's parlor time. The kitchen was the servant's domain in the evening as in the day, and the specific management of the boundary between the family's parlor space and the servant's kitchen space was one of the consistent concerns of 18th century domestic advice literature. In practice, the arrangement was considerably more complicated and more various. The single servant of a middling household was not living in the specific servants' hall that the larger domestic establishments maintained as a distinct servant social space. She was living in a small house with a family, in close physical proximity, in conditions that made the specific spatial boundaries of the prescriptive literature somewhat theoretical. The servant who came through the parlor to lay the fire, who appeared to clear the tea things, who answered the door when visitors arrived. She was present in the family's evening space in ways that complicated the idea of separate social worlds within the same small house. The specific labor of the servant on the 18th century evening was considerable. The fire that kept the parlor warm required regular attention. Coal or wood needed to be added. the fire raked and managed, the ash eventually removed. The candles that lit the room needed to be trimmed. The specific task of snuffing the candles, trimming the wick to prevent excess smoking and ensure efficient burning, was a regular task that the servant performed. The tea service needed to be prepared, carried in, served, and cleared away. The supper needed to be prepared and served, however simple its components. The specific relationship between the mistress of the house and the servant was one of the central social relationships of the 18th century middling domestic interior, and its specific character was shaped by the specific social dynamics of a household, in which the two women were in constant close contact, but in formally unequal relationship. The domestic advice literature of the period was full of guidance about how to manage servants, how to maintain authority without harshness, how to ensure adequate performance without excessive surveillance, how to treat the servant with appropriate Christian consideration without blurring the specific social boundaries that the relationship required, the servant's own evening, what she did in the kitchen in the specific hours of the evening when the family was in the parlor, is less well documented than the family's activities, because the servants of middling households rarely left the specific kind of written evidence that would allow direct access to their experience. What we can reconstruct suggests that the servant's evening was not entirely without its own pleasures. The kitchen fire provided warmth and light. The specific tasks of the evening left some time for personal activity and the specific social life of servants, visits from other servants, the specific social network of domestic workers in a neighborhood was maintained in the specific spaces that the household's schedule allowed. Chapter 10. Letter Writing, Connecting to the World Beyond the Door. One of the most significant and most revealing activities of the 18th century domestic evening was the writing of letters. Not a secondary or occasional activity, but a central practice, a specific form of engagement with the world that the period's middling households invested in, with remarkable consistency and remarkable seriousness. The specific quantity of letter writing that the 18th century produced, preserved in family archives, in literary collections, in the historical records of everything from personal relationships to business dealings to political correspondence, is one of the period's most striking features when encountered directly. The middling household that has left a substantial archive of family letters had left a more intimate and more complete record of its specific life than almost any other form of evidence, because letters, unlike diaries, were written for a specific reader and therefore shaped by the specific relationship between writer and reader in ways that make them simultaneously personal and social documents. The writing of a letter in the 18th century was a specific physical process that required specific equipment and specific skill. The writing desk, the specific piece of furniture designed to hold the implements of writing and provide an appropriate surface for the act, was a standard piece of parlor furniture in households that wrote regularly. The quill pen, prepared from a bird's feather by cutting the nib to the appropriate shape and angle, required specific skill to cut correctly and needed to be recut as it wore down during use. The ink, in an inkwell made to a specific formulation that balanced fluidity with drying time, was applied to paper that was not cheap, that needed to be chosen for quality appropriate to the specific use. The writing of a letter was therefore an investment in materials, in time, and in the specific cognitive labor of composing text that was clear, complete, and appropriate to the relationship between writer and reader. The specific conventions of 18th century letter writing, the specific forms of salutation and closure, the specific register appropriate to different types of letters, the specific management of the page to minimize paper use, were knowledge that the literate 18th century person possessed and applied as a matter of course. The content of 18th century family letters is one of the richest sources available for understanding what the domestic evening actually contained. Letters written from one household to another, from a daughter at school to her parents, from a husband away on business to his wife at home, from siblings in different towns to each other, described the specific activities of the specific evenings that the writer was experiencing, what had been eaten, what had been read, who had visited, and what had been discussed, what the children had done and how they had behaved, the small, specific, ordinary events of domestic life that letters preserved precisely because they were what the correspondent needed to communicate to maintain the specific relationship with the person they were writing to. The postal system that made this correspondence possible was one of the significant achievements of 18th century infrastructure and its specific development. The postal rates, the routes, the specific reliability of delivery that different parts of the system achieved shaped the practices of letter writing in ways that the letter writers themselves were constantly negotiating. Postage was paid by the recipient rather than the sender, creating specific social dynamics around the obligation to accept a letter and its cost. The practice of crossing, writing in one direction, and then rotating the paper and writing across it at 90 degrees, doubling the amount of text per sheet, was a specific response to the specific cost of additional sheets. Chapter 11. Religion and the Evening, Prayer, Reading, and Moral Accounting. The 18th century middling household was, in the vast majority of cases, a household with an explicit religious identity and an explicit religious practice that shaped the structure and character of the domestic evening in specific ways. The specific religious evening practice of the 18th century Protestant household, the family prayers that opened or closed the day, the Bible reading that was a regular feature of household routine, the specific moral self-examination that the period's dominant religious culture encouraged, was not uniform across all households, and the specific form it took varied with the household's specific religious tradition. The dissenting household, the Quaker, the Methodist, the Baptist, the Presbyterian, practiced religion in specific ways that differed from the Anglican household, but both maintained the principle that religion was a domestic as well as a public practice, and that the household had specific religious obligations that the evening was one occasion to fulfill. The family prayers of the 18th century household, gathered around the fire, perhaps kneeling, certainly with a specific attention that the act of prayer required, were typically brief but regular. The specific prayers used were drawn from the specific tradition of the household. The Anglican household might use the Book of Common Prayer. The dissenting household might use extempore prayer led by the head of household. The Methodist household might use the specific hymnody that John Wesley was developing as one of the characteristic practices of his movement. The hymns deserve specific mention because they were not primarily a church practice in the early Methodist tradition. They were a domestic practice, sung in homes, in small gatherings, in the specific household settings that Methodist revival found most effective. Charles Wesley's hymns, among the most enduringly influential pieces of religious verse in the English language, were written for exactly this kind of domestic performance and the specific experience of a household singing together around the fire. The verses that articulated their shared faith was one of the distinctive features of the 18th century religious revival's domestic culture. The Bible reading that was a regular feature of many 18th century household evenings was not casual or cursory. The specific practice of reading the Bible systematically, through specific books or passages in order, maintaining a rhythm of continuous engagement with the text was one of the recommended religious habits of the period's devotional literature, and households that maintained it were engaging in a specific literary as well as religious practice. The specific experience of the Bible, as read text, encountered in the specific domestic context of the evening, with its specific rhythm of narrative, poetry, prophecy, and instruction, was a genuinely formative cultural experience for the people who maintained the practice through the years of their adult lives. The specific religious books beyond the Bible that circulated in 18th century middling households, the devotional literature, the sermon collections, the improving tracts, the specifically 18th century religious periodical press, were a significant element of the household's reading culture, and their specific presence in household libraries and household inventories tells a story about the specific integration of religion and reading in the domestic evening. Chapter 12. Children. The evening from a smaller perspective. The 18th century domestic evening was not organized around children. This is a specific and important distinction from the modern domestic evening, which in many households is substantially organized around children's needs, schedules, and activities. The 18th century middling household had a different relationship between adult domestic life and children's experience, and the specific position of children in the household's evening tells a story about the specific childhood of the period. Young children, below the age of approximately 6 or 7, went to bed early. The specific management of young children's sleep in the 18th century was not the elaborate, negotiated process that modern parenting culture has developed. Children went to bed when the household determined they should go to bed, which in most middling households was before the specific evening activities of the adult household were fully underway. The evening was adult time, and small children were not present for most of it. Older children, from approximately 7 or 8 upward, had a more complex position in the household's evening. They were expected to contribute, to perform the specific tasks appropriate to their age and gender, to participate in the household's activities in appropriate ways, and to develop the specific accomplishments, needlework, music, reading, the various skills that the period valued in young people, that the evening's activities allowed them to practice. The education of children in the 18th century middling household was not confined to school hours. The domestic evening was an educational context, one in which children observed the specific practices of adult domestic life, participated in them at appropriate levels of competence, and developed the specific skills and habits that would prepare them for their own adult domestic lives. The daughter who sat with her mother during the needlework hour was learning to sew. The son who listened to his father read the newspaper was developing a relationship with the print culture that the period valued. The child who sat at the periphery of the adult's card game was learning the rules and the social conventions of a game they would eventually play. The specific children's literature that the 18th century was developing, the specific category of books written explicitly for young readers that began to emerge in the latter half of the century, with authors like John Newbery, Sarah Fielding, and eventually the enormous output of the evangelical children's publishing industry, was part of the household's evening reading culture. The stories read to children, or read by children independently if they were old enough, were deliberately instructive, designed to communicate specific moral and practical lessons through narrative. But they were also entertainment, and the specific experience of being read to in the evening by a parent or older sibling was an experience that many 18th century adults remembered as formative. Chapter 13. The winter evening, when the dark hours were longest. The 18th century household's relationship with the evening was not consistent through the year. The winter evening, the specific long dark period that stretched from late afternoon to late morning in northern England, had a specific character quite different from the summer evening, and the specific activities and atmosphere of the household in winter darkness deserve separate treatment. In winter, darkness came early. By 4 o'clock in December, it was dark. By 5 o'clock, the candles that had been needed since mid-afternoon were the only light available, and would remain so for the next 14 or 15 hours until dawn. The specific economy of candle use, the management of an expensive consumable over a very long period of darkness, was a real household concern, and the specific household practice of clustering activities in the best lit area, of managing candle trimming to maximize light efficiency, of going to bed earlier in winter when the alternative was burning candles for additional hours of darkness, reflected this specific material reality. The cold was the other specific feature of the winter evening that shaped the household's behavior. The specific management of warmth in a house that depended on a single fireplace per room, or in many middling households, fewer fireplaces than rooms, meant that the winter evening was managed around the fire in ways that the summer evening was not. The specific gathering of the household in the single heated room, the specific decisions about which rooms were heated and which were not, the specific management of drafts and cold that the household's physical structure made challenging. These were the material conditions that shaped the winter evening's social character, the specific intimacy of the winter evening. The household gathered close to the fire, the curtains drawn against the cold and dark, the specific warmth of the single-lit and heated room against the cold and dark outside, is one of the most evocative aspects of 18th century domestic life, and it is an intimacy that the period's literary culture recognized and valued. The specific coziness, the German concept of Gemütlichkeit, the Danish concept of Hygge, the specific English domestic comfort that has no single word, but that is immediately recognizable. That the winter hearth created was a genuine feature of 18th century domestic experience. The longer evenings of winter meant more time for the activities that the evening contained, more time for reading, for cards, for needlework, for conversation. The specific books that the household read in winter evenings were not different from those read at other times, but the specific immersive quality of winter reading, the book in the firelight, the warmth of the single heated room, the dark and cold outside, was part of why winter reading had a specific character. The 18th century novel was partly a winter evening entertainment. Chapter 14. The visiting neighbor, social life, and the permeable door. The 18th century middling household's evening was not always purely domestic, not always just the household members in their own space. The specific practice of visiting, of neighbors and friends moving between households for the specific purpose of sociable evening company, was one of the most important social activities of the period, and it happened frequently enough that the evening with visitors was almost as normal as the evening without them. The specific social geography of visiting in an 18th century town was organized by proximity and familiarity in ways that modern social life, with its greater geographic mobility and its mediated communication, doesn't quite replicate. Your social circle in an 18th century middling town consisted substantially of the people who lived near you, the neighbors whose domestic lives intersected with yours in the specific ways that proximity produces. You knew them. You knew their specific habits and their specific character. The specific visiting relationship was maintained through regular contact rather than the occasional reunions that modern social life produces. The specific form of the evening visit was informal compared to the more elaborate social occasions of the period. You arrived, you were received in the parlor, you sat, you were offered tea if the timing was appropriate, you talked, you possibly played cards, you departed at the appropriate hour, typically before the household's bedtime, in the 9 o'clock range. The specific conventions of visiting, the appropriate time to arrive, the appropriate length of stay, the specific social obligations of the host toward the visitor, were established customs that the period's social literature described, and that the period's social practice observed with reasonable consistency. The conversation of the visiting evening was the specific public version of the domestic conversation that the household conducted with itself. The presence of visitors introduced topics and perspectives from beyond the household, brought news from other parts of the town's social network, and created the specific social dynamic of performance that company always introduces. The household that was conversing among its own members could be entirely itself. The household that had visitors was maintaining the specific public presentation of itself that the social world required. The specific social occasions that the 18th century domestic calendar contained. The evening party, the musical evening, the card party, were formal versions of the visiting practice, organized in advance for a larger number of people than the casual dropping in visit. These occasions required specific preparation. The parlor arranged for the larger gathering, the refreshments planned and prepared, the specific entertainment organized in advance. The card party, a gathering explicitly organized around card playing, with tables set up for whist, and the household's social network invited to participate, was one of the most common formal domestic social occasions of the period. Chapter 15. Going to bed. The end of the evening and its rituals. Sometime between 9 and 11 o'clock, the household went to bed. The specific timing varied by household, by season. The winter evening ended earlier than the summer one, and by the specific events of that particular evening. A card party that was going well might continue past the normal bedtime. An evening without visitors might end early if there was nothing particular to sustain it, but the general rhythm was consistent. The evening had a specific endpoint, marked by the specific rituals of the household preparing for sleep. The fire was banked, not extinguished, but covered with ash and coals, in such a way that it would maintain enough heat to be easily restarted in the morning rather than starting from cold. This specific technique of fire management, maintaining overnight warmth without using fuel to sustain a full fire, was a practical skill that reflected the specific economy of fuel that the household maintained. A fire that went out overnight meant a cold morning start. A fire that was allowed to burn freely overnight consumed fuel unnecessarily. The candles were extinguished carefully because an improperly extinguished candle could be a fire hazard in the specific wooden and textile-rich environment of the 18th century house. The specific technique of candle extinguishing. The use of a snuffer, a cone-shaped cap that excluded oxygen from the flame, rather than blowing out the candle, which could scatter hot wax, was a household practice with real safety significance. The warming pan, a long-handled copper pan filled with hot coals, used to warm the bed before lying down, was a standard piece of household equipment in winter, operated by the servant or by the housewife herself to make the specific cold of an unheated bedroom tolerable. The specific experience of getting into a pre-warmed bed in a cold room, the warmth of the warmed sheets against the cold of the room, was one of the small specific pleasures of the 18th century domestic evening. The bedchamber that the household retired to was not the specific, separate, private sleeping space of modern domestic arrangements. The 18th century bedchamber was frequently shared, by spouses certainly, but also sometimes by children and servants in households, where the number of bedrooms was less than the number of household members. The specific privacy of the bedchamber was different from modern bedroom privacy. It was more porous, more shared, more embedded in the general social life of the household. The specific ritual of undressing and preparing for bed. The removal of the specific 18th century clothing that required assistance. The stays that women wore, the shoes that needed unbuckling, the specific layers that the period's clothing required, was a process that, for women especially, had specific requirements for assistance. The servant who helped the mistress undress at the end of the day was performing a specific, intimate task that marked the specific boundary between the social evening and the private night. The prayers that ended the day, the specific bedtime prayers that the household's religious practice required, were the last organized activity of the 18th century evening, and their specific character varied with the household's religious tradition. A brief prayer of thanksgiving, a specific petition for the night's safety, the Our Father as a closing formula. These were the specific words that ended the evening and marked the transition from wakefulness to sleep. Chapter 16. The Clock, How the 18th Century Household Experienced Time, and Why It Mattered More Than You Think. The clock on the mantelpiece was not decorative, not primarily, not in the specific, purely aesthetic sense of the object placed on the mantelpiece, because it looked well there and filled the space that the mantelpiece's horizontal surface invited filling. The clock on the mantelpiece of the 18th century middling household parlor was a functional instrument whose specific presence in the room was the presence of the specific new relationship with measured time that the 18th century was in the process of establishing, and whose specific ticking was the specific audible marker of the household's integration into the organized, scheduled world that the commercial and industrial transformation of the period was producing. The relationship between the 18th century household and measured time was different from the modern relationship in ways that require specific imagination to appreciate. The modern person wakes to an alarm, checks the time on a phone before their eyes have fully focused, manages a schedule whose events are timed to the quarter hour, and experiences the day as a sequence of specific temporal intervals whose management is the primary organizational activity of adult life. The 18th century middling household was moving toward this relationship with time, but had not yet fully arrived at it, and the specific transitional character of the period's timekeeping is one of its most revealing features. The domestic clock was a relatively recent arrival in the middling household by the early 18th century. Before the specific technical developments of the 17th century, the pendulum clock, the anchor escapement, the specific mechanical innovations that made accurate timekeeping possible at household scale. The clock was an instrument of the church tower and the great hall, not the parlor. The church clock told the community what time it was through the specific audible medium of the bell. The household organized its day around the church bell's signal rather than around its own private instrument. The specific social significance of the household clock was accordingly the significance of the privately owned time. The specific domestic autonomy of knowing what time it was independently of the church tower or the town bell. The household with a clock was the household that had internalized the measurement of time as a domestic resource rather than a public provision, and this specific internalization was part of the broader 18th century development of the private domestic interior as a self-sufficient cultural space. The long case clock, the specific form that the 18th century domestic clock most often took in middling households who could afford one, was a piece of furniture as much as an instrument. Its specific vertical form, the hood housing the clockwork, the trunk housing the pendulum, the base providing the stability and the visual weight, was designed to stand against a wall, to be part of the room's furniture arrangement, to be looked at as well as listened to and consulted. The specific craftsmanship of the case, the joinery, the decorative veneer or paint, the brass fittings of the dial, was the craftsmanship of the furniture maker applied to the housing of the clockmaker's mechanism. The sound of the long case clock in the 18th century parlor was the specific regular ticking of the pendulum and the specific melodic chiming of the hours and quarters that the more elaborate mechanisms produced. The chime was not merely informational, it was the specific acoustic punctuation of the evening, the regular reminder of the time's passage that the household experienced as part of the room's sound environment. The specific Westminster chime that some clocks produced, the 4-bar musical figure that sounds the quarter hours and the full hours, was a musical event in the parlor's acoustic landscape, anticipated and registered by the household members who heard it mark the transition from one quarter hour to the next. The pocket watch was the specific personal timekeeping instrument of the 18th century man who could afford one. The instrument that extended the clock's function from the domestic interior to the public space, allowing the individual to carry measured time on their person and to synchronize their specific movements with the timed schedule that the commercial world was increasingly demanding. The pocket watch was expensive, it was a social marker of some significance, and its specific presence in a household's inventory was an indicator of the household's position in the upper portion of the middling range. The management of the clock, the weekly winding that the long case clock required, the specific setting of the time against the church clock or the town's official timekeeper, the occasional regulation of the pendulum length to correct for the drift that temperature changes produced, was a household responsibility that the head of household typically performed. The specific weekly ritual of clock winding was one of the small but regular household maintenance operations whose performance was part of the specific domestic competence that the period valued in the head of household. The evening's relationship with the clock was the relationship of the activities we have already described with their specific temporal boundaries. The tea was taken at a specific time. The supper appeared at a specific time. The visitors were expected at a specific time and departed at a specific time. The prayers that ended the day were said at a specific time. The specific temporal organization of the evening was maintained against the clock's authority rather than against the vaguer authority of the sun and the season that had organized domestic time before domestic clocks were common. But the clock's authority was not absolute, and the specific variable relationship between the 18th century household and its clock reveals the transitional character of the period's timekeeping. The evening that extended beyond its usual closing time because the card game was interesting, the visit that ran longer than the social conventions, strictly permitted because the conversation was good, the bedtime that shifted by an hour or more in response to the specific events of the specific evening. These were the specific practical negotiations between the clock's measured time and the evening's actual time that the period's domestic life consistently produced. The clock was also the specific anxiety-producing instrument of the 18th century commercial household, whose business obligations made time genuinely consequential in ways that the earlier, less commercially organized domestic world had not experienced. the tradesman whose workday began at a specific hour, whose appointments were made for specific times, whose commercial obligations were organized around the clock's authority. This was the person for whom the domestic clock's presence was the presence of the commercial world's time discipline within the domestic interior, a reminder that the evening's freedom was bounded by the morning's obligations. Chapter 17. The Medicine Chest. Health, illness, and the domestic management of the body in the evening. Someone in the household was unwell. Not dramatically, not fatally. The specific, ordinary unwellness of the 18th century middling household that was the background condition of domestic life, rather than the exceptional crisis. A child with a cold. A husband with the specific headache that the day's work had produced. A wife with the specific ailment that the 18th century medical vocabulary described as the vapors, and that covered a range of conditions from genuine illness to the specific, exhausted low spirits that the demands of household management could produce. The 18th century domestic evening was not always the comfortable scene of tea and conversation and needlework. It was sometimes the scene of the sick person on the settee, the worried parent by the child's bed, the specific domestic medicine that the household managed without professional medical assistance. The medicine chest was a standard piece of 18th century middling household equipment, the specific portable cabinet of pharmaceutical preparations that the household maintained for the management of the ordinary illnesses that didn't require the expensive intervention of the physician. Its contents were the specific available medicines of the period, the specific patent medicines that the expanding 18th century pharmaceutical trade was producing and advertising in the newspapers, with the specific enthusiastic health claims of an industry that had no regulatory framework to constrain its marketing, the Daffy's elixir, the Turlington's balsam, Dr. James's fever powders. The specific names of the period's proprietary medicines are a catalog of the 18th century's pharmaceutical imagination, and they were in the medicine chests of households across the social spectrum. The domestic medical practice of the 18th century middling household was primarily the medical practice of the woman of the house, the housewife, whose role included the specific medical management of the household's health in ways that modern people associate with professional medicine rather than domestic competence. The housewife who knew how to manage a fever, how to prepare the specific herbal preparations that the domestic tradition recommended for different ailments, how to administer the patent medicines with the specific judgment of the experienced domestic practitioner. This was the woman whose medical knowledge was a genuine component of her household management skill. The specific herbal knowledge of the 18th century domestic practitioner was the knowledge of the written tradition as well as the oral one. The specific household recipe books and medical guides that circulated in the middling household as the reference literature of domestic medicine. The receipt book, the specific household manuscript that contained recipes for food, household preparations, and medicines in the specific, undifferentiated mix of the period's domestic knowledge, was one of the most important documents in the 18th century household, and its medical contents were as seriously maintained and as frequently consulted as its culinary ones. The physician was available in the 18th century town of any size, but the specific cost of the physician's consultation, the fee for the visit, the cost of the specific prescriptions the physician wrote, made professional medical attention a resource the middling household reserved for the genuinely serious illness rather than the routine management of the ordinary ailments that the domestic medicine chest addressed. the specific economic calculation of whether an illness warranted the physician's expense was a regular feature of the 18th century household's management, and the diary entries and letters of the period that record household illnesses almost always include the specific calculation of whether the doctor was called and what the decision was based on. The evening was the specific time when illness was most managed, when the sick member of the household was most present in the domestic space, and most in need of the specific attentive care that the evening's relative freedom from the day's work allowed. The child who had been unwell through the school day was the child tended in the evening by the mother whose day had been organized around other demands. The husband who had managed the day's work, despite the specific pain of the tooth or the specific misery of the cold, was the husband who allowed himself the specific domestic comfort of the evening's care. The specific fear of serious illness in the 18th century was the fear of the household that had no reliable treatment for the genuinely dangerous diseases: the smallpox, the typhoid, the childbed fever, the various epidemic infections that moved through 18th century communities with the specific periodic devastation of the world before vaccination and antibiotics. The specific presence of death in the 18th century household was more immediate than the modern household experiences, and the specific management of that proximity. The religious framework that made death meaningful, the domestic practices that managed serious illness, the specific emotional strategies of the household facing the possible loss of a member, was part of the specific texture of 18th century domestic life, that the comfortable picture of the evening around the fire exists alongside rather than instead of. The specific 18th century development of inoculation against smallpox, the specific controversial practice of deliberately infecting with mild smallpox material to prevent the severe disease, introduced to England by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in 1721, and debated throughout the century until Jenner's vaccination superseded it in the 1790s, was a development that the middling household had to take a specific position on. The specific decision to inoculate a child was a genuine household management decision of significant consequence, made in the specific context of the evidence and the specific arguments that the period's medical debate produced, with the specific weight of the parental responsibility for the child's health, providing both the motivation and the anxiety. Chapter 18. The Newspaper: How Print Connected the Domestic Interior to the World. The newspaper arrived, not in the specific digital sense of the notification that arrives on the phone with the specific ambient omnipresence of modern information delivery, in the specific physical sense of the printed sheet that the carrier delivered on the specific day of its publication, folded and sometimes dirty from its journey, whose specific arrival in the household was a genuine event in the day's information environment, rather than one more input into the already continuous stream of information that the modern household manages. The 18th century newspaper was a different kind of object from the modern newspaper in ways that shaped how it was read, shared, and discussed. It was smaller, typically a single large sheet folded to produce 4 pages, compared to the multi-section broadsheets of the later period. It was less frequent. A provincial paper was typically weekly, though London had daily papers by mid-century. It was more expensive relative to household income. The specific stamp duty that the government levied on newspapers throughout most of the 18th century added to their price, and was specifically politically motivated to limit the reach of print to those who could afford it. The specific economics of newspaper reading in the 18th century middling household were the economics of a shared resource rather than a personal one. the single copy of the weekly paper that the household subscribed to, or borrowed from the circulating library, which often included newspapers in its subscription, or read at the coffee house, where papers were provided for customers, was read by multiple household members and often passed between households. The specific recycling of the newspaper through the social network of the middling community was the specific information distribution system of the period. The reading of the newspaper in the evening parlor was typically a communal activity in the specific sense that the material read was discussed, that the news item or the advertisement or the specific parliamentary report that the paper contained became the subject of the household's conversation in the specific way that shared print culture creates shared conversational reference. The household that had read the same paper was the household with the specific common information that the evening's conversation could build on. The content of the 18th century provincial newspaper was the content of the specific information needs of the specific commercial community it served. The shipping news, which vessels had arrived and departed from which ports, what cargoes they carried, was read by tradespeople whose specific commercial transactions depended on the movement of goods. The bankruptcy notices, the specific legal announcements of commercial failures that the newspaper carried as required notices, were read by creditors who needed the specific information about whether their debtors had failed. The market prices, the specific weekly commodity prices that the paper recorded, were the specific commercial data that the trading household used to manage its buying and selling decisions. The political news was the political news of the specific 18th century parliamentary culture. The specific debates and votes and political events that the papers covered with varying degrees of completeness and bias in the specific language of the 18th century political press that was partisan in the specific way of the period's print culture. The specific reading of the parliamentary debates was a genuine civic activity for the middling household member whose commercial interests and whose specific position as a ratepayer and voter in the local political community gave political events a specific practical relevance. The advertisements in the 18th century newspaper were the specific window into the commercial culture of the period that the historian finds invaluable and that the contemporary reader found practically useful. The patent medicines were advertised in the specific, extravagant language of the 18th century pharmaceutical trade, the specific goods available from the specific local merchants, the runaway servants, the lost horses, the stolen goods that the 18th century equivalent of the classified advertisement communicated to the reading public, the specific theatrical performances at the local theater, the specific auctions of estates and household goods. The 18th century newspaper's advertisement pages are a more complete and more vivid picture of the specific commercial and social life of the period than almost any other documentary source. The specific political sensitivity of the newspaper was a genuine feature of the 18th century press environment. The stamp duty that the government levied was one mechanism of press control. The specific legal liability of printers and publishers for seditious libel was another. The 18th century history of press freedom, the specific legal battles over what could and could not be printed, the specific cases of printers prosecuted for publications that the government found offensive, was the background against which the middling household read its newspaper, and the specific awareness that print was a politically consequential medium gave the newspaper a weight that the modern reader of the ubiquitous contemporary press may not fully register. Chapter 19. The smell of the evening. the specific sensory reality that nobody writes about the 18th century parlor had a smell, not a bad smell necessarily, not by the standards of the people who lived in it and who had no alternative reference point for what a room should smell like, but a specific smell, quite different from the specific non-smell of the modern centrally heated interior with its synthetic materials and its ventilation systems and its specific odorless neutrality that the modern person experiences as the normal baseline of indoor air. The specific smell of the 18th century parlor in the evening was the accumulated smell of everything that happened in it. And understanding that smell is understanding something about the specific sensory texture of the period's domestic life that the written record almost never addresses, because smells are among the hardest things to document in historical sources. The fire was the dominant smell, the specific wood or coal smoke that the fire produced, imperfectly contained by the chimney, leaking back into the room in the specific variable way of a system whose performance depended on the wind direction, the chimney's draft, and the specific management of the fire, was the background smell of the heated 18th century interior. Wood smoke had a specific aromatic quality that the modern person occasionally encounters in the specific nostalgic form of a campfire or a wood-burning stove. Coal smoke was different, more acrid, more sulfurous in its specific chemical character, the specific smell of the industrial period that the 18th century was beginning. The room that had been heated by coal for hours had a specific, accumulated coal smoke smell that the household members didn't notice because it was their normal. The candles were the second dominant smell. Tallow candles, the rendered animal fat that the cheaper candles used, had a specific, greasy, slightly rancid smell when burning, the specific product of the fatty acid combustion that the tallow's composition produced. The household that burned tallow candles for an evening accumulates a specific layer of this smell in its air, a smell that the modern person would find distinctive and probably unpleasant, but that the 18th century household found simply the smell of the candlelit room. Wax candles smelled better. The beeswax combustion produced a specific honey-adjacent scent that was genuinely pleasant, but they cost more, and the middling household managed the candle budget accordingly. The food was the third specific smell. The supper preparations that the EI kitchen was producing during the early part of the evening, the cold meats being arranged, the bread being cut, the specific pickles being brought out of their storage, sent their smells through the house in the specific, permeable way of the 18th century domestic interior where the kitchen and the parlor were not hermetically separated. The smell of the tea brewing, the specific aromatic steam of the kettle, and the infusing leaves was a specific, pleasant addition to the evening's olfactory environment. The food smells of the 18th century kitchen were the food smells of the period's cooking, the specific animal richness of the roasted meats, the vinegar sharpness of the pickles, the yeast smell of the bread, the specific warmth of the spiced drinks. The bodies in the room were the fourth specific smell, and here the 18th century parlor diverges most sharply from the modern room. The specific body odor management of the 18th century was the management of the person who bathed infrequently, not because they were dirty in any moral sense, not because they lacked the specific domestic aspiration toward cleanliness that the period's domestic culture valued, but because the specific labor and fuel required for a full bath made it a relatively infrequent event. The specific daily management of the body was the management of the partial wash, the hands and face and neck, and the management of the clothing whose linen layers were changed more frequently than the outer garments, and whose specific laundering absorbed the body's emissions. The linen was the specific technology of 18th century personal hygiene, the white linen shirt or shift that was worn next to the skin, whose specific cotton or linen fiber had the moisture management and cleaning properties that made it the appropriate skin contact layer. The linen that was changed frequently was the specific hygienic practice that compensated for the infrequency of the full bath, and the clean linen of the recently laundered garment was a specific personal cleanliness standard that the period recognized and valued. The perfume was the specific countermeasure. The scented water, the lavender bags, the specific pomanders and sachets of aromatic herbs and flowers that the 18th century household used to manage the specific smell environment of its interiors. Lavender was the specific dominant scent of the 18th century domestic interior. Stored in the linen cupboard among the clean laundry, scattered in the rushes, and stored herbs of the floor coverings, used in the specific sachets that were placed in clothing storage. The specific lavender smell of the well-managed 18th century household was a genuine smell of cleanliness rather than of perfume in the modern sense. The specific smell of the tobacco that the man of the house smoked, the clay pipe that was one of the specific masculine domestic pleasures of the period, was the smell that the parlor accumulated when smoking was part of the evening's activities. The specific pipe tobacco of the 18th century was not the same tobacco as the modern cigarette. It was a specific aromatic preparation of cured leaf that the clay pipe delivered in the specific contemplative form of the slowly smoked bowl that was the evening's accompaniment to conversation or reading, or the specific meditative quiet of the man who was thinking about his day. Chapter 20, The Children's Hour. What happened between supper and bed for the youngest members of the household. The children had not yet gone to bed, not the very youngest. They had been put down hours earlier in the specific managed way of the 18th century household that did not organize its evenings around the children's schedule, but the children of the middle years, the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old, the 12-year-old, who occupied the specific transitional position between the nursery and the adult parlor, were present in the evening in the specific ways that their age and their households' specific customs permitted. The children's relationship with the evening parlor was a relationship negotiated between their specific developmental needs and the specific adult culture of the room. They were present but not dominant. They participated but were not in charge of the participation. The specific learning that the domestic evening provided, the observation of the adult world in its specific evening mode, was one of the primary educations of 18th century childhood, and the child who sat at the margins of the adult gathering was the child who was learning through specific, continuous observation how the world they were growing into actually worked. The specific tasks that the 18th century child performed in the evening were tasks appropriate to their age and gender. The girl of 10 who sat with her sampler, the specific embroidery exercise that was the foundational needlework practice of the female 18th century education, was performing the specific educational labor that her mother's needlework hour made visible as the adult destination of the child's practice. The sampler was not just a sewing exercise. It was the child's specific introduction to the domestic textile culture that would be a primary occupation of her adult life. And the specific patience and precision that the sampler demanded were the patience and precision that the adult needlework required. The boy of 10 who sat with a book, or who was required to sit with a book, the distinction between the two being the specific variable quality of the book and the specific variable engagement of the reader. was performing the specific educational practice that the 18th century middling family's investment in literacy demanded. The reading that happened in the domestic evening was not always the reading that the school day produced. It was sometimes more interesting because the specific books available in the household were not the specific dull texts of the grammar school, but the actual books that the household's culture valued. The history, the travel narrative, the improving biography, the carefully selected fiction that the specific parental judgment had decided was acceptable for children. The specific parental supervision of children's reading was one of the consistent features of 18th century domestic child management, and the specific anxiety about what children read, about whether the books available to them were appropriate in their moral content and their intellectual level, was the specific 18th century version of the media consumption anxiety that modern parents experience about screens. The circulating library's stock of novels was the specific contested category of children's reading that the parental gatekeeping was most consistently applied to. The improving biography and the religious narrative were the specific approved categories. The boundary between the two in actual household practice was the boundary that the specific individual household negotiated according to its specific cultural values. The games of the children's evening were the games of the period's play culture, the specific physical and social activities that the domestic interior permitted in the evenings before bed. Spillikins, the specific dexterity game of removing individual sticks from a pile without disturbing the others, was a standard domestic game for children of multiple ages. Card games designed for children, or the simpler card games that children could play alongside adults, were part of the evening's organized play. The specific indoor versions of the physical play that the outdoor day had contained. The chase, the catching game, the specific rough play of children who had been sitting still for hours and needed to move, were the play that the household managed within the specific constraints of the evening interior. The bedtime story, the specific oral or read narrative that some households provided as the transition between the evening's activity and the child's sleep, was not yet the codified practice that the 19th century would establish as the standard feature of children's domestic life, but it was present in the 18th century household in the specific, informal way of the parent who read to a child at bedtime because the child wanted to hear something, and because the specific moment of the child's bedtime created the conditions for the specific, intimate reading that the more active evening had not permitted. The specific prayers that ended the child's day, the bedside prayers that the 18th century religious household required of its children, were the specific religious education of the evening's final minutes. The child who knelt at the bedside and recited the specific prayers that the household's tradition required was the child performing the specific religious formation that the 18th century parent regarded as among the most important obligations of their parenthood. The specific prayers were not long, they were not elaborate. They were the simple, regular practice of the habit that the household's religious culture maintained through the specific daily repetition that formed the habit most reliably. Chapter 21. The occasional evening, celebrations, visitors of note, and the domestic special occasion. Some evenings were different. Not the ordinary evenings, the specific comfortable routine of the tea and the needlework, and the cards and the supper that the previous chapters have described. The evenings that were different were the evenings organized around specific occasional events: the birthday, the return of a family member from a journey, the visit of a relative from another town, the specific calendar occasions of the year that the household marked with the particular food and the particular gathering. and the particular effort that distinguished the special occasion from the ordinary day. The birthday celebration of the 18th century middling household was not the elaborate, child-centered production of the modern domestic occasion. It was a specific adult acknowledgement of the passing year. A gathering of the household and possibly close friends, a specific, better supper than the usual. The specific small gifts that the period's gift-giving culture deemed appropriate, and the specific toast that marked the occasion in the specific language of the 18th century's raised glass culture. The child's birthday was marked, but less elaborately than the adults, and the specific inversion of the modern domestic birthday, in which the child's celebration is the major domestic event, and the adults is a minor one, had not yet occurred. The return of the traveler was one of the specific domestic occasions that the 18th century household treated as a genuine event. The return of the husband from the business journey, the return of the son from his apprenticeship placement, the return of the daughter from the specific visit to relatives that had taken her away from the household for weeks or months. The specific welcome home gathering that the household organized for the returning member was the specific domestic ceremony of reunion that the period's correspondence and diary literature records with consistent warmth. The specific food prepared in the returning person's honor, the fire made up more generously than usual, the specific gathering of the household around the newly returned member whose absence had been felt in the specific ways that the household's accounts of it reveal. The New Year's gathering was the specific calendar occasion that the 18th century household marked, with the specific gathered company and the specific food and drink of the celebratory occasion. The specific customs of the New Year in the 18th century English household varied by region and by specific household tradition. The wassail, the specific spiced drink that was the New Year's toast of some traditions. The first footing that the Scottish tradition practiced, the specific songs and games that different regional traditions attached to the transition from one year to the next. The common feature was the gathering. The specific household expanded by its invited company. The specific evening made longer and more lively than the ordinary. The specific threshold of the year's end marked with the specific energy of the occasion that deserved to be marked. The harvest supper, the specific annual occasion of the autumn that the rural households adjacent to the middling town maintained, and that the urban middling household knew through its specific connections to the agricultural world that supplied it, was the specific communal eating of the year's end that the agricultural calendar produced. The middling tradesman whose livelihood was connected to the agricultural economy of the surrounding countryside, the miller, the merchant who traded in grain, the innkeeper whose custom included the harvest laborers, had specific connections to the harvest celebration that made the harvest supper a genuine event in the household's calendar. The evening party, the specific formal domestic occasion that was organized in advance for a larger gathering than the casual evening visit produced, required the specific domestic preparation that separated it from the ordinary evening. The parlor furniture rearranged to accommodate more people, the refreshments planned and prepared with a specific attention to what the company expected, the specific entertainment organized, the card tables set up, the musical program planned, the specific social activities that would fill the evening selected with the awareness that the assembled company expected to be entertained. The specific anxiety of the domestic entertaining occasion was the anxiety that the 18th century domestic advice literature addressed with the specific frequency of a topic that its audience consistently worried about. The specific concern that the occasion would not go well, that the food would not be adequate, that the entertainment would fall flat, that the household would fail the specific social test of the successful party, was the specific social anxiety of the middling household that understood its domestic entertaining as a performance of its specific social standing and wanted the performance to be successful. The morning after the special evening was the specific domestic reckoning, the accounting of what had been spent, what had been consumed, what the specific occasion had cost the household in the specific material currency of the candles, and the food and the drink that the gathering had required. The 18th century housewife, who maintained the careful household account that the period's domestic advice literature recommended, was the housewife who recorded the specific costs of the special occasion alongside the ordinary costs of the ordinary day. And the specific comparison of special occasion expenditure with the ordinary household budget was the specific practical management of the domestic economy that the careful household conducted as a matter of course, the specific memory of the special evening, the conversation that had been particularly good, the song that had been particularly well performed, the specific moment of shared laughter or shared pleasure that the occasion had produced, was the specific social capital that the household's entertaining generated and that persisted in the household's memory as the specific evidence that the occasion had been worth the specific effort and expense it had required. The 18th century domestic occasion was not merely the organizational challenge of its preparation. It was the specific human event that the preparation made possible. The gathering of people who were glad to be together in the specific space of the household that had made itself ready for them. The door closed behind the last guest. The candles were snuffed. The fire was banked. The cards were put away, and the tables returned to their ordinary positions, and the supper things cleared to the kitchen. The household moved through the specific closing rituals of the evening that the special occasion had expanded and delayed. Tomorrow was the ordinary day, but tonight had been the special one. And the 18th century middling household that had organized its parlor and its provisions and its company for the specific purpose of an evening that would be remembered had achieved what every domestic occasion has always been attempting, the specific temporary transformation of the ordinary interior into the space where something worth remembering happened. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the hour. The household went to bed. The specific quiet of the closed house settled over the specific rooms where the specific evening had happened. It was enough. Conclusion: what the evening tells us. The evening is over. The fire has been banked. The candles are out. The cards have been put away, the needlework folded, the teacups washed and returned to the shelf. The household is in bed, and the specific quiet of the 18th century house at night, the absence of the specific ambient noise that modern houses maintain through refrigerators and heating systems, and the general electronic hum of powered things has settled over the rooms. What has the evening told us? It has told us first that the 18th century middling household was a specific achievement, not a given, not a natural condition, but the specific product of a specific historical moment in which a specific class of people had achieved sufficient economic security and sufficient cultural aspiration to invest in the quality of their domestic life in new ways. The parlor with its fire and its candles and its carefully chosen furniture was not ancient. It was new. It was the specific creation of the specific period we've been examining, and it was genuinely new. It has told us, second, that the evening was the specific time when the household was most fully itself. When the specific identity of the household, its specific values, and its specific pleasures, and its specific relationships were most fully expressed. The morning was work, the afternoon was work. The evening was when the household gathered and became, for a few hours, the specific community that it was. It is told us, third, that the specific pleasures of the 18th century evening, the tea, the music, the reading, the conversation, the cards, the needlework, the visiting, were not trivial. They were the specific cultural practices through which the period's middling class defined itself, maintained its relationships, developed its skills, and made its existence meaningful. The pleasure was genuine, and the pleasure mattered. The specific gap between the 18th century evening and the modern evening is large enough to be visible, but small enough to be recognizable. We do not bank fires, or trim candles, or write letters by hand. We do not play whist by the firelight, or embroider by the warmth of a single heated room. The specific material conditions of the 18th century domestic evening are historical, and they are gone. But the impulse that animated the evening, the desire to be home, to be warm, to be with people you know, to read something interesting or play something enjoyable, or talk about something that matters. That impulse is not historical. It is present. It is in some sense what we are still doing in our evenings, in our specific way, in our specific moment, with our specific tools. The people in the parlor around the fire in 1755 were doing what we are doing, trying to make the evening good, trying to make the specific domestic interior of their specific lives feel like the place they were glad to be. We are still trying. We are, if anything, trying in conditions of remarkable privilege compared to theirs, and they would have found our evenings completely incomprehensible and probably a little alarming, but they would have understood what we were trying to do.